Greetings, my name is Courtney, and thank you so much for taking a moment out of your day to join me for this short video on creating components for React and Gatsby. Now, when designers first begin to write code for their work, it typically takes the form of simple HTML and CSS. Everything is a very manual process when you're just getting started. As our projects become more complex, this approach quickly becomes unsustainable, and you'll begin to look for ways to find efficiencies in your work. In this series, we've been using Gatsby, which leverages React to help speed up the development process. In this particular video, you're going to create your first reusable components, which will make creating and updating your project infinitely easier. As I stated a moment ago, components are reusable pieces that you can use over and over again in your project. Think of these like Legos. However, unlike Legos, you'll never run out of them, and you can create as many varied shapes and sizes as you want. Now, there are two main types of components: functional components and class components. You may hear them referred by other names, but they're pretty easy to spot. Both functional components and class components feature presentational elements, but class components are more complex, allowing them to handle logic to determine how, what, and when they display information. While a functional component might be the nav bar, a class component could be the entire page, as pages are more complex and need to handle logic. Another easy way to tell the difference between these types of components is simply to look at the syntax. Here in VS Code, I'm going to write out a simple functional component and a simple class component so that we can focus on the syntax that's involved. In the examples that we've created above, both pizza and pizza menu are essentially the same thing. One is a functional component, here we have pizza, the other is a class component. And there's a couple of things that make the class component more robust. It has individual render and return methods, it extends React component, and it could handle an expansion like this if we decided to pass some bit of logic through to the class component. We did not do this, so these are virtually the same in the eyes of React, which means that aside from calling pizza and placing it inside, so this functional component has a version of itself in here, and I can repeat that. I can repeat that over and over and over again if I like. Aside from that one little difference, these are basically the same. If you are creating a page inside of React, I think it's best to go ahead and use a class because there is a possibility you may bring logic into that component at some point. Otherwise, you're probably better off just going with a functional component. But let's take a moment now and actually use this knowledge inside of a project. To get started, let's first navigate to the command line. Now that we're at the command line, I'd like us to create a new Gatsby project. So we'll type in Gatsby, new. I'm going to call this one minimal because the resource we're going to call in is the absolute smallest Gatsby project we could have. And for this, I'm going to navigate over to GitHub. The Gatsby.js account has a Gatsby starter world file. I'm going to copy that URL. I'm going to place it at the end of my new project, and I'm going to hit enter. Okay, so that should have loaded really fast for you. I'm going to go ahead and Command K to clear out my screen. The first thing you'll need to do is navigate into the project. And now I'm in my minimal project. I want to run Gatsby develop to see what it produces to the screen. I'm going to go ahead and go over to localhost 8000. And as you can see, literally all that we have here is hello world. This is a virtually empty project. If we go ahead and go back to command line, and I'm going to type in code dot so I can open this up in VS Code. What you'll see right away is that there's very little here. In the SRC folder, there's a pages folder and an index.js. That's it. That's literally all that's here. If I click on index.js, this is the entire page right now for the index. As you can see, it's importing React from React, but this should look pretty similar to what you've seen before. You just saw a functional component, and that's what's being used right now to print hello world to the screen. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to add some structure to this so that it will replicate the component-driven Gatsby files that you'll likely encounter in the future. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this Components. And inside of that Components folder, I'm going to create a new file, and this will be nav.js. Now, if we look at index.js, there's a very important line that is here that you may not have seen before. Import React from React. While many of your components will be very complex, all of them will import React from React. So we're going to copy that line right now and move it over to the nav.js. The next thing we want to do is create a functional component. And if you remember the syntax that we used before, it was const. In this case, I'm going to call this nav. We had an equal sign, parentheses, an arrow function. We could, in fact, just write our code here. So if I want to say h1 and call this pizza nav, if I just wanted to say that, that would be fine. But if this is going to be complex at all and involves anything more than one line, it needs to have parentheses. So I'm going to go ahead and encase this in parentheses, and then I will rewrite this as a nav. So I'm going to create a div, and then inside of that div, I will say. Now the final thing that we need to do, we need to export nav so that it's available to other components for use. And once this is stitched all together, you can see we have import React from React, our functional component, and then an export statement. All this making it available for index.js to use. The next thing that I'd like to do is update index.js. I'm going to go ahead and delete away this first line, and next I want to import nav. While index was a functional component before, this is the index page, which means it's going to likely handle some logic in the future. So what I'm going to do is change this into a class component. Let's go ahead and open up Terminal, and let's run Gatsby develop from here just to see what this has produced. As you can see, Terminal has in fact produced an error for us, but the error is a warning. It's not a serious break. It says nav is defined but never used. So before we go over and check out how it's loaded, I'll go ahead and just add nav now. Save it. And actually we created a bigger issue. As you can see, it says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. You might be at this point asking, what the hell is JSX? JSX is really powerful because it allows us to leverage JavaScript inside of what appears to be regular HTML. To solve for this issue right now, though, we need to wrap nav and this div that we have below it inside of another div. However, that's not exactly what React and the people who created React want you to do. They want you to use something called React Fragment. React Fragment was brought into the world in reaction to a lot of people simply using extra divs in these instances. That was causing problems with all sorts of things like CSS Grid. So React Fragment is a really clean way to avoid that error that we had before, but also it allows us to render presentational things like CSS Grid seamlessly. We'll go ahead and save this. And now you can see it compiled successfully. Let's go ahead and look at what it did for us. To call this plain would be an understatement. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually write some CSS inside of our JavaScript, particularly in that nav element, so that we can give this some semblance of styling. Let's go back to nav. So now I'd like to create a variable to store my CSS in. So let's take a second and review what we've got here. We've created something called nav style that has a color of red. So that should be turning our text red. If we go ahead and check over on our localhost, you can see the pizza logo here is now in fact red. To connect the variable that we created with the functional component, this is a version of inline styling. This is really no different than if I were to take this property of color red, delete away nav style, and simply place it directly in line. This would produce this very same thing. I'm going to save it and go back over, and as you can see, it's still there. Now I want to go back to what we were doing before because I think this is a little easier to read, and there are many ways that you can use CSS inside of JavaScript. Another thing that I wanted to point out before we move forward is we didn't really want this to be on the text. We wanted this to be on the entire navigation bar all the way across. So what we're going to do is we're going to name this background color. But instead of what we call kebab casing, which is where we use the dash, we're going to use camel casing, which is preferred in JavaScript. Let's save that. And now, as you can see, we're going all the way across the page. I want to go ahead and add some padding in as well. And if I did that, I would say padding, and let's just say 30 pixels. Now, you can see right away I've already broken it because I used a semicolon. I'll use a comment instead. That didn't work either, and that's because CSS inside of JavaScript needs to be passed over as a string. So I'm going to wrap this in quotes and save it, and as you can see, it compiles successfully now, and when we come back over, now our CSS is in fact showing up as we expected it to. We still have an issue here though. See this border that's all the way around the element? That means that we have not properly reset the browser for this project. To reset how this is showing up in the browser, I'm going to go to mini-reset.css, and I'm going to simply download that information, and I'm going to drop that into a new file that I'm going to place in components, and I'm going to call that new file reset.css, drop that information in. I will now come into index.js, and I will call that in import /components /reset.css. I will save it. You can see that it is compiled successfully, and when we refresh this, you can obviously see now that that border is going all the way to the edge, our project is now going to render properly. The fun thing about this is if I added more of these nav bars and just use them over and over again, you would see right away that it just fills the screen. There's a lot more that you can do with components, but I hope that this example, building a functional component, building a class component, connecting those together, adding some simple styling using CSS inside of JavaScript, while also resetting a project just using a standard style sheet as you've seen before. I hope this gives you a sense of what is possible with components inside of Gatsby and React. In upcoming videos, we're going to be expanding on this concept of styling inside of JavaScript, and we'll be building more complex components. I'm Courtney for New Pragmatic. If you're liking these videos, please click subscribe. We'll talk soon.